So this video is going to cover how to analyze other mixing engineer signal chains and processing, and how working that into your mixes can generate new ideas and capture the flavor of your favorite records. The example that we'll use as a reference for this video is deconstructing the recording process from the 1950s and 60s, and how sort of deconstructing this and applying my own research can enable us to get a more vintage tone for the overall mix that we have here. And these are just the same stems that we've been working with in the previous videos, so if you'd like to download them with the course resources to follow along, you can do it that way as well. So first, what do I mean by this? While watching videos and learning about how different effects devices are used in your recording process is very helpful to improve, researching how a record was made can be equally as helpful. So learning about the recording, production, and mixing process of your favorite records and how this all contributed to the sound and the tonality of these various different recordings. So for example, I've really been into a lot of vintage mixes recently that have a heavy use of tape and tape distortion. So records like the early Motown records, so songs like My Girl by The Temptations, especially those drums that you hear throughout the track that have really, really heavy tape distortion on them, because they really overdrived the input into the tapes. They gave you this very saturated and really cool sound. And also records like Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys and early Johnny Cash records as well. Hence why I selected the example for the mixing course that I'm working with today. Because in a moment I'll show you how to make this sort of vintage, almost folk country track sound a little bit more like an old recording. And this process of researching records doesn't have to be a vintage mix either, or something more old school. It could be something modern like the new Tame Impala record, or something electronic like experimental bass recordings that are being released on Division Records, or anything in an electronic style. So the idea of researching the processing and recording and mixing of all these different records can apply to any different style of music. Then once you kind of have the sound for your mix that you want to go for, so you sort of have a song reference, strategically research the process of production. So what recording equipment we used, what effects were used on the records, and even things like songwriting and how they went about tracking and recording each of these individual instruments. So do a deep dive into forums, forum posts, magazine interviews, listening to the songs as references, and even watching documentaries about the making of these different recordings. You'd be surprised about the amount of information that's floating around on which microphones, microphone preamps, and effects were used on various different records. So for example, whenever I was looking around on forums, I found a forum post that was asking what gear and effects were used on early Johnny Cash records, and there was actually a response by a studio technician who helped record everything, who answered a bunch of questions about what types of microphones, preamps, and compressors were used on those old records. So you can find a surprising amount of information online about these different records and how they're made. And to take a more modern example, I really like a lot of the experimental bass records that are being released on Division Records, which is the record label that Noisier runs. And a few of the artists who had actually written songs that I really liked the sound design and textures of, I actually found interviews where they were breaking down their track process and exactly how they went about producing and mixing those various different records. So this gave me some ideas of how I could bring those recording processes and some of those mixing techniques and ideas into my own recordings to get the same type of style that they had going on with their tracks. So what you learn from this research process will enable you to capture the essence of that sound that you like. Then you can incorporate that back into your mixes. So now let's jump into a practical example, and I'll show you how to take some of the research that I've done previous to this video and incorporate that into the mix that we have here. So the overall flavor that I want for these mixes is going to be the more vintage sounding records from the 1950s and 60s. And I want to bring some of that flavor into my mix. So I won't be searching forums in this video, but what I have previously looked up was what recording techniques were used on Motown records, which I mentioned previously. I like a lot of the taped out recordings that they have. They sound really cool. And what recording techniques and preamps were used on early Johnny Cash records. So from my previous research, digging around on forums and magazine interviews, I found out some of the information about how these studios were set up, and then we can incorporate some of that into our process. So the first thing that they used a lot of was Altec preamps, especially in the Motown records. These were tube preamps that were quite inexpensive at the time. So many studios have them, and they're very fat and distorted sounding. So that's the first thing. And on early Johnny Cash records, they also used another tube preamp. It was a Uray 710, I believe is how you say it, which was another very noisy tube preamp. They used lots of tape machines, and especially Motown liked to high-frequency bias their tapes, which means that the high frequencies had a nice crunch to them. So that's something that we can bring into our process. They also used vintage mixing consoles as well. These helped to provide clarity and sort of that punch and color of those mixes. So what we could do here is always go buy a bunch of nice vintage gear, but that'd be definitely way too expensive. And there's a lot of things that we could do with plugins to emulate this sort of vintage recording process inside of this mix that we already have. So let's go ahead and recreate the signal chain that they had on these early Motown records as much as we can. So we could start off on something like these drums, and let's start off with a preamp. So we'll use a tube preamp. There's actually a really excellent VST version of the Altec preamps from Soundtoys. And that's going to be the Little Radiator plugin, which is actually modeling the exact same preamp that they used in a lot of Motown records. So in terms of the mixing process, everything would first hit the tube preamp, then would go through the signal chain, so then it would go into the console, then it would go into the tape machine, and then back into the console. So let's first start off with that preamp. Let's grab a console emulation. We'll just use Waves NLS. They have a nice console emulation that I use quite a bit. We could change this over to the Nevo preamp, which just models a Neve console. Maybe give that just a touch of drive here. Grab another Waves plugin, J37. So then out of the console, everything would go into a tape machine. And this is just something that I researched previously to this video. So I looked up what the original signal chain was for a lot of these recordings. Things would go into a tube preamp, into the console, and then out the console into a tape recorder. And then from that tape recorder, things would go back into a console. Then the other final change that I want to make is go to this tape. And we could leave most of the things where they are by default, except for the bias. I want to have this to +5. So that way it biases to the high frequencies, gives our high frequencies just a little more crunch and distortion, which is something you had on a lot of those early Motown records. And then we're going to change the tape formula to 811, which emulates on this plugin an older style of tape. So I'll go ahead and just turn everything on one by one. So you can hear a lot of that distortion. Sounds super nice. I love the way that sounds. It's very crunchy. We got the console emulation, the tape, maybe even drive that input just a little bit. Kind of helps kind of flatten things out and even them out a bit, especially on the bass. Then we got the last console emulation as well. So you can hear those drums go from sounding very clean and very modern to being a lot more crunchy and distorted in kind of this nice vintage way. And all we did here was emulate the signal chain and recording process of these old records, where things would go into tube preamps, then to a console, then to a tape machine where they'd be recorded, and then they would be routed back into a console. And then I'll show you before the effects how it sounded, and then after where everything's kind of been run through these vintage recording processes. So we'll jump over the percussion. We could just paste that in as well. That way our percussion has a nice sound. We could do it on the bass too. Go to our acoustic guitar, the electric guitar bus, and we could actually have this EQ happen afterwards because that's what would be happening in the original signal chain if this was actually recorded on a vintage console. We could also paste in that to the piano. And we'll also have the EQ happen afterwards as well. So altogether, that mix sounds like this, and then I'll show you the original as well. So we've totally changed the overall feel of our entire mix down. We haven't even started to really mess around too much with compression, equalizers, or lots of reverb effects. Instead, all we did was recreate just one part of the old school recording process, and it totally changed the way that our whole mix sounds. Now we go from being this very modern and very clean sounding record to something that's a lot more vintage, distorted, and crunchy sounding. So that's just kind of an idea of how you can apply this idea of using research on your mixes to sort of incorporate that flavor from those records that you really like. And this really could be anything. It doesn't have to be a vintage sounding mix. It could be a very modern and bright sounding electronic mix. You can use strategic research around how that record was made, what sort of softwares they used, what kind of instruments they used, so VSTs if they use Serum or Sylenth or the new copy of Massive. By researching this process, it enables you to learn a lot more about how things were mixed, and you can incorporate some of that flavor into what you're doing. So take some time on your next mix sound to have a deep dive into various different forums, magazines, videos, and interviews, then incorporate some of that information into your next mix to get some of the character from those mixes into the new projects that you're working on.